We are excited today to be celebrating something that we've been working on for a long time and ask a question of what if? What if God can do even more? William Carey said it well, because if we say, what if God can do even more? He said, well, it's kind of a silly question, because we know, of course, God can do more. And it's important because we reflect and we say we expect great things from God, and we attempt great things for God. We don't do it with the expectation that we have great abilities or great powers or that we ourselves are great, but we say God can do great things, and we can attempt challenging, big, difficult things if they are for Him, because they are dependent upon Him. And so we're grateful here to be able to gather and recognize that God has done a lot in our midst over the last 200 years as a church. But it's not just a past involvement, that God has done some things back then. God is continuing to work within us, in our midst, and throughout the challenges of COVID, sustaining opportunities for us to declare Christ in our community. Whether that's online, whether that's Sunday mornings, whether that's on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and all the different events and opportunities and different age groups that gather and connect in the various spaces here at Eastport Bible Church. It's pretty cool to see the impact that starts here, having an impact in places like Tanzania, East Africa, with my brother-in-law who grew up in this church and was impacted by this church and is now a missionary helping send missionaries to unreached people groups in Africa. And you go, wow, that started here. And as we look around the country, we see that there's chaplains and pastors at Christian universities in different places around the country, in places like Florida and Michigan and Washington, shaping future generations because of the impact that happened here. You and I probably know many different families and individuals and people who are in the area or who have since moved to other parts of the country whose lives have been changed by the truth of God's word as it has been connected to life through the people, the programs, and the opportunities that we as a church are able to provide. See, we as a church have the same mission we've always had, whether we've had it in these words or not, but we want people to know Jesus. We want people to grow to follow Him, and we want people to go and help other people to do the same thing, to multiply followers of Christ. And so for the last 3 weeks, we were talking about why we're here. Why are we doing this? We're doing this so that people can know, people can grow, and people can go. And so as grateful as we are for what God has done and what God is doing, we recognize God is not done, and so we are not done either in pursuing and expecting more and greater things from God and for God, that He is the focal point of it all. I hope as you came in this morning, you were able to get a couple of the things that we've been working on for a while. There's some more up front if you need them after the service or by the doors as well. I want to start with just the white one to turn your attention there. It says Unlimited Potential. This one can help you understand a lot of why we're doing this, what we're doing, some of the timelines and details, and you can go ahead and peruse that as well. And as you're going through that, you'll find that in the back page, there's also this card. It's called a commitment card. Don't do anything with this today. We're just warning you. We're just giving you an opportunity so that you're not surprised by it, that this is how we are looking to the future of how each of us can be involved, and we are all going to be embarking for the next 3 years on a final push to see this building become a reality for the mission and purpose of God here in this community and for this generation, but also beyond this community and beyond this generation, just as for the last 200 years there have been generations before us that have left an impact and left a legacy that we are privileged to be a part of here. I mean, can you imagine if we got together this morning all in that room, and that was church, and that was the limitation that we had, but there's been generations before us who have looked ahead and gone, what if God can do more? And we're in a similar sense asking the question, what if God can do more? And there's a lot of great details in here, and then in 2 weeks, we are going to get together, and we are going to provide an opportunity for anybody who's excited about what God can do to join us in that and say, I want to be involved with that. And over the next 3 years, I'm going to be involved financially. And maybe you or I think, I don't know if I can make a big dent in that. On the back of this card, there's just an example of us as a church. We have 80 giving families in our church, and you go, $13 a week adds up to $2,000 over the course of 3 years. Now, that makes a pretty big difference, and so maybe that's me, maybe that's you saying, well, if I go out to eat once a week, that's that 13, 15 bucks, whatever. I'll make a sandwich that day instead, and I can have an impact. And it looks different for all of us in different ways. But what we want to present over the next several weeks is what we believe God can do and God will do, and how we are seeking to pursue that and simply provide you an opportunity to join us in that. Finally, we have this blue handout. This is what we're going to talk about today. This is what we're going to leave you with. I'm not going to get into great detail now, but everybody needs one of these before we leave today. If you don't have one in person, those are also on our website. There's a link there now. It says Unlimited Potential, New Building. You can click on that, and you can download all of these materials, watch that video, and connect in other ways as well. But this is the thing that we want to start with today. That today we're going to be beginning a 21-day spiritual journey. And that simply means we're connecting with God's Word, we're connecting in prayer, we're asking the questions of ourselves and of our lives, of how we are pursuing and of how we are following God in this process, because this has to start with prayer. This is a God-focused endeavor that we expect great things from God, and we're going to attempt great things, but only with God's help, with His ability, His power, and dependence on what He can do in our midst. So we've been looking forward to this day as a church for a long time. We made a lot of progress, but over these next few weeks, we're going to be launching our final push for the next 3 years, that we can see this dream completed. That we can help this community, this generation, and communities beyond, and generations beyond, to know, grow, and go even better than we have now or in the past. Now, I believe this is a God-given dream, but as I read in the Bible, I see a lot of dreams and a lot of dreamers. And some have God-given and God-honoring dreams, but some have selfish and self-serving dreams. And it's important to recognize the difference between those things that come from God and those things that come from and are pointed towards us. I want to look at the example today of David, and you might know David. He's a pretty famous individual in the Bible. He's known as the one who started out as a shepherd in the fields, who fought off the animals, who defeated the giant Goliath, who ended up becoming a king. And he had a God-given and a God-honoring dream, which we're going to look at today in 1 Chronicles chapter 22. That's way near the beginning of your Bible if you don't go there very often, and we're going to have it on the screen as well so we can follow along. And I want to look at the example of David and spend some time seeing how the people of Israel pursued God's dream, because I think it applies to us, and we can gain some principles and learn some things from how they pursued God's dreams to how we can today as well. So where we pick up is near the end of David's life in 1 Chronicles chapter 22. Solomon, his son, is about to become king, and they gather everyone together to get everybody on the same page about what their future as a nation, what Solomon's future as a king is to look like. And he lets them know about the temple that is going to be built in the nation of Israel. They didn't have a temple at that point. They had the Ark of the Covenant that they'd brought from Egypt, and they'd made on their way to the Promised Land. They brought it across the Jordan and been in this tent. And David was a well-established king at this point. He had this great palace, and he says, "Here I am living in luxury, and the house of God is a tent that's old and needs help. We can do better. What if God can do more than this?" And he talked to God, and God said, "You're not going to be the one to build it. Your son will. You have been a man who's shed a lot of blood, fought a lot of wars. You can get ready for it, but you're not going to see it." And so we pick up in 1 Chronicles chapter 22, and David says this in verse 14. He says, "I have taken great pains to provide for the temple of the Lord." And he says to Solomon, "And you may add to them." He's talking about all the gold, the silver, all the things that he has gathered in order to build this temple. And he says, "I've already sacrificed a lot for this great task, this great project, this great opportunity, and you can add to it as well." And then he challenges them to begin the work. You see, David had made sacrifices for a lasting, a legacy, something that would outlive and outlast him, that he wouldn't ever get to see. But he said, this is important because it is a God-honoring endeavor, and future generations will be pointed to God because of what happens here. And so David says, for me, it's worth it to sacrifice so that this will happen for future generations. And I find it pretty cool to be in a building like this, where we can easily reflect over the history and heritage that we have of 200 years, where there have been multiple generations before us who have looked to the future and said, God can do more here. And we, as descendants of that generation spiritually, are able to enjoy their sacrifice. We're able to gather in these buildings and basements and kids' spaces and utilize them well. And we look forward to embarking on a similar endeavor that 10, 20, 50, 100, 200 years from now, there are people who can gather and say, we want people to know, grow, and go. And I'm sure glad some other people in the past invested in making that happen so that we can take advantage of opportunities now that we never could have then. And in a similar way, we're grateful for the legacy that was left before us of people who said, we're not content just to leave things as they are, but we want to expect great things from God and attempt great things for God that will last for generations into the future. And so the people gathered for this commissioning, this charting of sorts, and then we pick back up in 1 Chronicles 28. They gather again together after listing a whole bunch of details about this. It says in chapter 28, verse 12, he, David, gave him, Solomon, the plans of all that the Spirit had put in his mind for the courts of the temple of the Lord and all the surrounding rooms, for the treasuries of the temple of God and for the treasuries for the dedicated things. He goes on in verse 19, he says, all of this, after describing all the things that they've set aside, all this, David says, I have in writing from the hand of the Lord upon me. And he gave me understanding in all the details of the plan. I find that interesting. David says, Solomon, these aren't just my plans. These are God-given, God-directed, and God-honoring plans, which he has helped me bring to this point, and it's up to you to complete what God has begun. See, I think God-honoring, our God-given plans are God-focused, are God-exalting, are God-honoring. Sometimes I hear the question, does God want me to do this? And it's in contradiction to this. God will never tell you to do something that is in contradiction to what God has already said. God will never say or lead you to do something that is not God-honoring, God-directed. How do I know if it's the will of God? I think one of the simplest ways to know if it's God's will or not is who it makes a big deal about and who it honors. So often in life, we struggle over decisions and choices and circumstances. What does God want from me? And a lot of times we're just trying to kind of convince ourselves that God wants me to make a big deal about me. When really God is always wanting us to make a big deal about him and recognize that he is God, not me, and put him on the throne of my life, not me. And so in a similar sense, David recognizes that these are God-given plans because they are God-focused and God-honoring plans, not to serve himself or his name or his image, but to serve God and his greatness and his image and to honor him in this world. And so as they are gathered here saying these plans are from God because they point people to God, he says in chapter 29, verse 1 of 1 Chronicles, then King David said to the whole assembly, my son Solomon, the one whom God has chosen, is young and inexperienced. The task is great because this palatial structure is not for man, but for the Lord. We also have a great task, but the focus is the same, that it is not for me or you, but for God and his mission here and for the people that can be impacted and reached by what God can do in our midst. As we look towards our new building here, we see that this new building is for God's mission, for his purpose, not ours. This isn't just the space we say, we need some more places where we can just kind of hang out and relax and have some fun. There might be some fun opportunities that do arise from a building like this, but ultimately the goal of a space like this is not just so we can get together and have a good time, but so that people can know, so that people can grow, and so that people can go. You see, this is a God-focused mission and purpose that we get to participate in as we expect great things from God and attempt, as David says, a great task that lied before them. And as they looked at this incredible task, this large building they were preparing to build, they said, this is kind of overwhelming. And in verse 2, it says, with all my resources I have provided for the temple of my God. I've already gotten ready. I've already prepared what is mine so that this can happen. Besides, in my devotion to the temple of my God, I now give my personal treasure. So in addition to his kingly abilities to say, oh, give some of the tax money, he says, what was mine I give, the treasures of gold and silver for the temple of my God. Over and above everything I provided for this holy temple. See, David says, I'm all in. I am sacrificing and giving personally and generously so that this will happen not for me, not for you, but for Christ, for God. We see this biblical pattern. And he goes on in verse 6 that it's not just him, but it says in verse 6, when the leaders of the families, the officers of the tribes of Israel, and the commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, and the officials in charge of the king's work gave willingly. David begins, David gives first, and the rest of the leaders also join in giving. And we see this principle that good leaders go first. David, as a good leader, gave first. The leaders in his community said, we think this is God-honoring vision that we want to pursue, and they gave before the people. We see it in times like David's time. We see it in our time, in our midst, and in places like Ukraine. We see it in our own lives, in our own bosses, in our own situations where the good leaders are the ones who are with you and who go first and join and share the burden instead of just saying, now you guys build a temple. That's not what David did. That's not what the leaders did. They said, we are giving and sacrificing first, and the result is this in verse 9. The people rejoiced at the willing response of their leaders, for they had given freely and wholeheartedly to the Lord. David the king also rejoiced greatly. I think this is one of the keys. That unforced generosity, it produces joy. Have you ever gotten a gift from someone and then you hear or learn that they felt obligated to give you that gift? Well, I kind of had to. I didn't know what to, so I just bought you this gift card. I hope you'll have, that doesn't necessarily make you excited or happy, does it? Compared to when someone gives you something, a just because gift, just because, hey, I was thinking of you, I wanted to encourage you, or whatever it is, and here's a way to do that. There's a big difference between the gift that is given freely, given generously, and the one that is forced that says, well, my mom said I had to, so. And in the same way, the people of Israel said, wow, look what God is doing. Because the king's not saying you have to give. The king is saying, look what God can do. He is giving first. And the rest of the leaders are joining and saying, we want to be involved in what God is doing. And the people went, wow, that's awesome. And the key here, I also think, is not just that this giving produced joy, but that it was a free and a wholehearted generosity. We are grateful to have had many generations before us get us to this point where we as a church, with our first building in 1853, the overflow over there, that was a big step. And I'm sure it was a big step in the 1890s when they added this and took that building that used to be pointed here and moved it over there and added on the sanctuary. Go, wow, those are some big steps. As they, in the 50s, dug the basement, and then the 80s added on the nursery and pre-K and the cave room downstairs to create more and more opportunities for people to interact with what God is doing in our community and say, man, where would we be today if it was not for the willing, wholehearted, generous people who came before us? And in a similar vein, we're grateful that there have been many before us here in this latest dream. You see, in 2005, that we as a church were able to purchase 8 Tuttle, just down the road here, 8 Tuttle Avenue, with the dream of having an adjoining lot that one day we can have these 2 buildings right beside each other to see what God is doing in our midst become even greater impact. It wasn't until 2017 we were able to purchase the house where we had services outdoors, the one that's falling apart and that was in the video there, right adjacent to 8 Tuttle. And in 2017, that provided us not just the 8 Tuttle, 6 Tuttle, and the gravel lot, which now can be combined and produce one space for this new multi-purpose building and gym. And so we began the planning process, including buying a different parsonage so that my family could move out of the way, so we could knock those buildings or move those buildings when the time comes. So we get to 2022, and we're starting this 3-year campaign, this 3-year final push to say, when our paperwork is approved by the Southampton town, we want to say, all right, now let's build, instead of, okay, now let's find out how we can do this. But when the paperwork is completed in 2025, we're looking forward to moving the house at 8 Tuttle or knocking it down, receiving that final approval, and beginning to build. We're grateful for the many who have already invested in those dreams being a reality, with those houses that have already been purchased to provide the land, provide the space. And we rejoice, and I believe God rejoices, when there's free and wholehearted generosity. That's not forced, that's not coerced, that's not a requirement. That doesn't say, well, you got to pay this much to come participate in what we're doing as a church, or you're required and you're required. It's, all right, here's what God can do. You are welcome to join. My wife and I have been praying and talking about this as well over the last months, as we say, look what God's already done, and look at what he can do. And so I just want to let you know, not so you think any different of me, but that we are with you in this. We've been praying and talking, and we are excited to partner over these next 3 years by giving 1 year of our 3 years of income towards being given to God's work. Now, part of that's still being offerings and missionaries and other things, but everything else from that 1 year out of our 3 years of income, we are excited to give as partners in what God is doing. Because we want to see this happen, just as we believe many of you are looking forward to seeing what can God do in our community. And so I tell you this not so that you think any different of me, but just to say, I am with you in this. We are with you in this. We are not asking you or saying, why don't you guys do something? But that we are excited to be a part of what God is doing, and we are joining you in this process. Part of the reason why? Well, it says it like this in 1 Corinthians 10. Verse 31, it says, so whether you eat or drink, whatever you do it all for the glory of God. For I am not seeking my own good, says Paul, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. See, it's pretty easy when we come to a crossroads like this, when we look to the future, and especially if we pull out a commitment card and we go, oh man, how are my finances going to be involved? It's pretty easy to go, I don't know. Or it's pretty easy to think, well, maybe that church wants my money. It's not about the money, and it's not about the building. It's about the value, and the value is this, that others may be saved, that people would know Jesus, that people would grow to follow him, and people would go help others to do the same. And so every time that we buy or spend our money on something, we're ultimately often declaring a value statement. You see, we could take the money that we are committing to give towards this project, and we could buy a new car with it. We could buy clothes, we could go on vacations, we could eat out a lot more, we could do a lot of different things, and we could enjoy it in a lot of different ways, right? And in the same way, you and I, we spend in a variety of ways throughout our weeks and months and years, and we buy a house or a car or clothes or eat out or go on vacation. And it's not just so those things can happen, but normally there's a value underneath that. Why do we do that? Maybe we have a car to get us from here to there. There's various ways to get from here to there, and then maybe we upgrade the car because we'd like to get from here to there a little more comfortably. And then maybe we change the car because we'd like to get from here to there with a little more comfort and style. And sometimes the reason we do things, the value behind it, we don't stop and think, what is the reason? What is the purpose? What is the true value of why I'm doing what I'm doing? And so we have an opportunity to declare, not just with our mouths, but with our sacrifices, what we value. And we're grateful to be able to join you in declaring our value of what God is doing, not just in different parts of the world, but doing here in this community, in this time, that will have an impact beyond here and now. You see, our goal as Christians, Paul's goal, as he says here, is not just for himself, but it's for others. It's for the glory of God, that others might be saved. See, people need Jesus, whether they know it or not, whether they believe it or not. And we are excited to look to the future and see a space that allows us to have different opportunities and different methods, even than we can do now, of helping people to connect together, not just with each other, but also to Christ. So whether we eat or drink or whatever we do it all for the glory of God. Not looking out for our own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. See, our dream as a church is not a dream of being a big church, but it's a dream of being a church with a big impact. Because there is good news that you and I are privileged to share and to share with others. We don't just want a building, we want people to know Jesus. We want people to grow. We want people to go help others do the same. And just as this building is a tool, so also we believe that in the future we will have another tool to be able to use and employ for what God is doing. And if that's something that gets you excited about the potential that we see in this and the unlimited potential that we believe God sees in a space like this, then you are invited to join us and participate in this. Not in a coerced way, but as a willing and a joyful giving, as David and the people in his time did. It's been great to be able to sit down with so many of you over the last few months and have sometimes meetings, sometimes just enjoy a meal or conversation and hear the different excitement about what God has already done and what we look forward to seeing God do. See, we're excited about the next generation, just like David was. David, after giving this speech and getting everybody together, they got together to transfer the kingship from David to Solomon. The next day, Solomon was going to be crowned king. David was still alive, was still the king, and he gathers them together, and he has this prayer after all these people have given. And I think that this prayer is important for us as we consider looking to the future and being involved in what God is doing here. It says this in 1 Chronicles 29:16. David is praying. He says, "O Lord our God, as for all this abundance, all the things that we've given, that we have provided for building you a temple for your holy name, it comes from your hand, and all of it belongs to you." David declares that everything that has already been given and everything that will be given, and we can declare that everything that has been given and everything that will be given comes from God in the first place. We give and can give because it all comes from him. It was true in David's time, and it's true of our time, that everything comes from God. And we have an opportunity to be involved in giving to something that is eternal. The second key here in verse 17, David prays, "I know, my God, that you test the heart and are pleased with integrity. All these things have I given willingly and with honest intent. And now I have seen with joy how willingly your people who are here have given to you." See, as we talk about and consider giving, the key here is to give willingly, with honest intent, honest motives from the heart. And when we give in that way, it produces joy for the giver and for those around us who see that kind of giving. You see, God does not want guilt-driven giving, and neither do we. We don't want a penny to be given towards this building that is given because we feel like I have to do it, and someone or somebody somewhere is going to think differently of me if I'm not. Now, honestly, I don't care if it takes us a little bit longer to accomplish this building, because this is not about a building. This is about God working in our hearts, and if he has to work in our hearts so that we can have a heart that is motivated by the right things and wholehearted in that generosity, then that's part of the process that's worth it. That's the right thing to happen in my life and yours, because this building is about helping people to know to grow. And sometimes the growing is the painful process of considering my own values and the things that I want to do with my life and my finances and having those surrendered to God and say, God, this is about you, not me. And God can work in our hearts and lives as we consider how we can wholeheartedly, willingly, and joyfully invest in what God is doing in our world. We're not going to use guilt. We don't want you to feel like you have to give. We would love for you to be involved. It does take all of us to make this happen. But it says God works in your heart. You see, God-honored giving that we see from David in his prayer right here is this. We recognize it all comes from God. It starts with him. And our giving is simply a reflection of his giving and his generosity already. We do it willingly, and that produces joy. And we're going to remind you of simply the basic facts as David also declared that God is at work, that we get to be a part of it. It all comes from him, and we can invest in a lasting legacy like many who came before us with willing hearts. And so today, as we begin to talk about the future that we are excited about over these next few weeks, we say, what do we do now? I think we start with a question. As we talk about what if God can do even more? There have been a lot of exciting things happening here that we have been able to be a part of. But what if God can do even more? David dreamed of a God-honoring future. And we're excited about a future that is God-focused and God-honoring as well. We're excited that this generation and future generations will be able to better know, grow, and go. And we're grateful that we have the opportunity to be a part of it with our time, our talent, and our treasure. I'm excited to look back 4, 5, 10 years from now and say, look what God did. Look what God's doing. I got to be a part of that. And we hope and pray that what God will do is something that will do generation after generation as people here and people far from here recognize that there were those who came before who dreamed a bigger dream, asking the question, what if God can do even more? And so our action point for today is simply this. I'm not asking you to give anything. I'm asking you to commit anything. I'm only asking you to begin with prayer. And so we've created Pastor Jeremy and his team, a 21-day spiritual journey that we invite you to participate in and join us for 3 weeks as we go through Know, Grow, and Go, as we connect with God's Word, as we connect in prayer. And so this is the one thing we do want to ask everybody to do. This is the one thing that really is not negotiable. This is the one thing that even if you have a bit of a grudging heart, we'd like to ask you to start praying about what God can do in our midst, that this is a God-focused and God-honoring endeavor, that we expect great things from God and we attempt great things for God, but we know that prayer is required of our relationship with God. So today, let's begin to dream and ask the question, what if God can do even more? And let's begin by praying. Let's start today and each and every day over the course of these next 3 weeks by coming to God and saying, God, we need you. God, this is about you. How are you going to be working? And then as we look ahead and we consider our involvement and our participation, I want you to consider preparing to give not in guilt, but with willing joy. And I think prayer is the key component here. Because we begin with prayer and say, God, how do you want me to be involved? And do what God says. Simple as that. Joshua 24:13. It says, but if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve. You see, there's many opportunities for us in our lives and how we live them and what we live them for. And Joshua gives the people a choice. What are you going to live life for? To choose which direction you are going to live it. And he says, me, my household, we will serve the Lord. Let us today commit not to an amount, not to giving, but to being people who live a life that is focused on and serving the Lord. Join me in prayer.